Well, this morning I'm wearing a very special pair of socks. They're my pink socks, or at least the closest I could get to pink. And the reason I'm wearing pink socks is in honor of a guy named Calvin Coburn. And Calvin went to the church that I spent most of my elementary and junior high school years at. He was this tall guy. I think he was 6'5" or 6'7", and he always wore pink socks. Didn't matter what outfit he was wearing, whether it was pants or shorts. He always wore pink socks. He loved pink socks so much, and that was even before it was cool to wear funky socks. Now you can get away with it more. But Calvin was an interesting guy. He was known for always handing out Jolly Rancher candies in his Sunday school classes that he taught. His front bumperless Jetta, and I was there when it fell off. He just stopped at a light and it fell off. And he got out as calmly as he could out of his car, picked it up, threw it in the back trunk, and just kept on driving by. But in the back seat of this bumperless Jetta was these enormous piles of apple cores and orange peels. And I mean, these things were tall. When I would get into his car, my feet would be about a foot or a foot and a half off the ground for all these apple peels and orange core or apple cores and orange peels that he had in the back of his car. Calvin worked a full-time job. He had a young family, and he taught Sunday school every single week. And I learned a ton from Calvin in Sunday school, but what made a difference for me was the time that he would spend with me outside of church. He was a huge baseball fan, and I was a huge baseball fan. And so from time to time, he would pick me up at my house, and we'd head out to the ball field. And we'd just hit a few balls around, play catch. And in the winter months, when we couldn't get out to the ball field, he'd invite me over to his house. I'd have dinner with his family, and I'd play video games with his kids. Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt were some of our favorites. We wouldn't spend a ton of time together, but it still meant so much to me that an adult would take even a little bit of time to hang out with me. You see, Calvin was showing me God's love by simply spending time with me. He was a busy guy. He didn't have a lot of time to give, but what little time he had, he gave it in service to God to teach and mentor youth. And you know what? God took that little bit, and he made a huge impact on my life and the lives of many of the other youth in our church. You see, God took Calvin's little and made it much. Our little is much in God's hands. Last Sunday, we began a new teaching series entitled Faith Is. And in this series, we're exploring the life of the prophet Elisha. Now, if I say Elijah, I mean Elisha. They're just too close together that I might get them mixed up sometimes, so hopefully you can follow along with what I mean. But we're looking at the life of Elisha to help us define what faith is. And last week, Dave defined biblical faith this way. It's confidence in God resulting in action for God. And he talked about how faith is being all in, burning the plows and cooking the cows. And this morning, we want to continue looking at what faith is through the story of Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 4. And in this story, Elisha has an encounter with a woman who is facing some incredibly difficult circumstances. This woman was at the end of her rope. Her faith was small. But then God steps in through Elisha, and she discovers that faith is giving all you have, even if it's just a little bit. And when you give all that you have over to God, you can see him work in some pretty powerful ways. So this story begins in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 1. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that he revered the Lord, but now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slave." Here we're introduced to the woman. We're not told her name, but we're told that she's married to a man who is part of the company of prophets. Sounds like something from a sci-fi flick. But this company of prophets, they were simply a group of older prophets who were training up younger prophets who would eventually take their place. Now, Jewish tradition tells us that the man's name was Obadiah. That was her husband. And if that's true, we know that he was a key player during the time when the awful King Ahab and his wicked wife Jezebel were going about trying to annihilate the prophets of God. It's important that we note, too, that since her husband was one who feared the Lord, and since she herself appealed to a prophet when she was in a time of trouble, that she was certainly a believer. This woman had a relationship with God. And at the beginning of verse 1, this woman, she cries out to Elisha. And the word cries out here means to moan and to weep uncontrollably, to shriek out of grief. And so this was an intense moment. You can just picture the urgency in her voice, her being so overwhelmed by emotion that she can hardly get her words out. In today's day and age, we would call this the ugly cry. And that's where she was. She was so overcome with emotion. But why was she in that state? Well, because her husband had just died. And she was left to take care of, to raise these two boys on her own. And back in that culture, women had little hope of ever getting employment. Her only hope was that her sons could work to pay the bills and to put food on the table. However, as it's assumed, this woman was in her mid-30s, her boys were young. And so there was little to no chance of them ever making enough to provide for the family. And keep in mind, in those days, there was no life insurance, no retirement plan, no social security, no welfare system. This woman didn't have a safety net to fall back on. She was totally destitute, totally on her own, with no hope or help in sight. And if that wasn't bad enough, her husband had accumulated debt. In 1 Kings chapter 18, we read this. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophet, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each. And he had supplied them with food and water. And so her husband had 100 men under his care. Think about how much it would cost to feed 100 people breakfast, lunch, and supper, and probably a few snacks in between. Perhaps he borrowed that money to do that, and that's where the debt came from. Or maybe he had some of his own personal debt. Either way, the debt was passed on to this poor widow. She was now responsible to pay back all of it. And like wolves howling at the doors, these compassionless creditors, they're knocking on her door wanting money. And she simply doesn't have any. She can't pay that debt. Now, it was customary in that day that if you had debts and you couldn't pay them, somebody in your family was going to be sold into slavery. And so these creditors that were knocking at their door, they wanted to take not one, but both of her sons and sell them to the highest bidder. Maybe she would see them again, maybe not. So she's not only penniless, but she also might lose her entire family. So this godly woman, she's now a widow with little to no income and is in debt up to her eyeballs, with creditors threatening to take her sons and sell them to the highest bidder. This is what we wouldn't call fair. It's not fair. This would put a dent into anyone's faith, put a dent in their confidence in God. This woman had faith, but at this point in her life, it wasn't much. And if anyone could say they were at the end of their rope, it would be this woman. But here's the thing. God usually does some of his best work at the end of the rope, when we have very little left to give. Perhaps that's where you are right now. You're at the end of your rope. Maybe your marriage is barely hanging on, or you're experiencing other troubles and other relationships in your life. Maybe it's something to do with your kids. Maybe it's an issue at work or a financial struggle. Maybe your heart is broken, your dreams have failed, your health is poor, or you're feeling the hurt and pain of grief. You have faith, but it isn't much. Maybe for you it's a different circumstance. Maybe you feel like life is missing something. You feel like you're just wandering around aimlessly. You feel lost. And the day-to-day routine of life is just draining all the joy out of you. You feel like things could be and should be so much better than they are. You have faith, but not much. Whatever it is for you, you haven't let go of the rope of faith yet. You're hanging on, but only by a thread. The good news is this woman will soon discover, is that when we're at the end of our rope and we have very little left to give, that is the moment when God does some pretty big things. Let's pick up the story in verse 2. Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a small jar of oil." See, although this woman's appeal is ultimately to God, she sought help from the prophet Elisha. You see, God so often meets our needs through other people. And Elisha responded to this woman's cry by first asking her, "How can I help you?" And in a sense, he's saying, what do you want God to do for you through me? See, Elisha was a man of God. But then he follows up his first question almost immediately. It's as if he doesn't even take a breath in between or wait for her to answer the question. He asks, "What do you have in your house?" Her first answer? Nothing at all. And here she does what most of us do. We focus on what we don't have rather than on what we do have. We focus on our bad circumstances, how limited our resources are, the things that we are missing in life. And when we get caught up in focusing on what we don't have, we limit the possibilities, and then things really are hopeless. Imagine if my youth leader just focused on how much time he didn't have. He was a busy guy. He could have simply said, "You know what? I don't have enough time to spend with these youth. I have a job, I have a family, I have things going on." That would have had a profound effect on me and the others that he taught and mentored. And he wouldn't have been a part of the big things that God could and did do through that little time that he gave. This woman's first response was to focus on what she doesn't have. But then, all of a sudden, something comes to mind. She begins to shift her focus from what she doesn't have to what she does have, as small as it is, a jar of olive oil. It's not much. It's just a little jar of oil. It was a big commodity back then, but all she had was a very little bit of it. It was a small amount. And as we'll see in the next few verses, she takes that little bit and she gives that little bit over to God, believing that with a little bit of faith, God would give her what she needs. And you know what? God shows up in a big way. You see, when we fail to tap into God's ability, his power to do big things, we fail to tap into it when we focus on what we don't have. But we get the advantage of God's ability when we're willing to give God whatever we do have, even if it doesn't seem like much. When life gets difficult, and it does for all of us at times, it's so easy for us to focus on what we don't have. But like this woman, God wants us to shift our focus shift our focus away from what we don't have to what we do have, and then give that little bit over to Him and allow Him to work. Maybe you feel like you don't have much to offer. You're limited in your time, your skills, your finances, your ability. What if you did, or what if you gave over that little bit to Him and to watch Him work? Don't have a lot of money? Give $5 a week and see what God does. Don't have a lot of time? Take half an hour, go volunteer somewhere and see what God does. Feeling emotionally drained, like you have nothing to give to others? Pick up the phone or text somebody else that's struggling and see what God does. When we give God all that we have with a little faith, we can see God do some amazing things through our faithfulness. And we'll see evidence of that as the story continues. But it does require something of us. Verses 3 and 4. Elisha said, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." See, it's not enough for us to just trust in God and then do nothing. Remember, faith is confidence in God resulting in action for God. And so you have to join God in what He's going to do. And the way that you join God in what He's going to do is by taking a step of faith. This woman and her sons, they had to take a step of faith in going door to door to collect these jars. It wouldn't have been an easy task. It would take great courage for them to knock on those doors and ask for the empty jars. They might judge them. The neighbors might reject them or refuse to help them. But they had to take the step of faith before God would work. When I was working at a community center, I took the step of faith in leaving that job because I felt like God was calling me to something different. It took courage. I didn't know what the next thing was going to be when I handed in my resignation. No other job to go to. Very little income coming in, and some people, mainly my wife, thought I was crazy for giving up a stable job. But it's when I took that step of faith, not before, that God began to reveal His plan to me. And He led me to start a drop-in center in Cambridge. And that drop-in center is still up and running today, 12 years later, and doing some pretty amazing things in the lives of youth in that area. You see, God wants us to take steps of faith before He'll jump in and bring about His plan. And oftentimes, those steps can and so often will take courage. Think about Noah and the great courage it took his and his family to follow God's leading in building the ark. Everyone around them thought they were crazy, but they took a little step of faith each and every day. And then they just kept stepping out in faith for almost 100 years. And of course, we know how that story ended. They were tapped into God's plan for the world. And I'm not saying we need Noah-like courage. I'm not about to build a boat in the middle of Brantford. At least not yet. But are we willing to give whatever courage we have, whether it's Noah-sized or the size of a pea, to step out in faith and see what God does? You see, when we fail to tap into God's ability when we don't step out in faith. But we get the advantage of God's ability when with courage we take a step of faith, even a tiny one. So are you willing to take a step of faith and see what God does? Are you willing to give Him your gifts, your resources, your time, even if all you have is a little bit? When we give all that we have, big or small, and we take steps forward in faith, we can tap into the amazing things that God is doing, the big things that he is doing. Let's take a look at what happens when this woman gives all that she has. And she takes a step forward in faith. Verses 5 and 6. She left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There is not a jar left." The oil stopped flowing. You see, God multiplied the amount of olive oil, filling every single jar that she had collected. Only when that last container was full did the oil stop flowing. You see, the amount wasn't dependent on the amount of oil in that small jar. The amount was dependent on how many jars she collected. And so if she had 50 jars, it would have filled 50 jars. If she went around and collected 100 jars, it would have filled 100 jars. Now imagine if out of fear she didn't take that step of faith. She didn't go door to door and collect those jars from her neighbors. And she just used what was in her house. It was her problem, and so she was gonna fix it on her own. She would have maybe had 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 jars of oil. And she would have missed out on the big thing that God was going to do. Sometimes we do the same. We want to try and fix the problems ourselves. We want to rely on our own ability instead of taking a step of faith and searching for more jars. We're too afraid, or maybe it doesn't seem logical to us. And so we fail to tap into God's ability by limiting the number of jars that we bring to him. Alan Carr tells this story of 2 men who went fishing. And one man had this strange habit. Every time he caught a trout, he'd pull out this little ruler and he would measure it. And if the trout measured longer than his ruler, he would throw it back. And so he ended up keeping all the small fish while throwing back all the big fish. And his buddy that had been by his side the whole day, he was watching all this. And as they prepared to leave, he said to his friend, "I can't stand it any longer. I've never seen anyone fish like you have. Why do you do that? Why do you keep the small fish and throw back the big fish?" Well, the man said, "Because I only have an 8-inch frying pan." So often we think too small about what God can do in us through our circumstances. Sometimes we think too small about the changes that he can make in our lives. Our frying pan is too small, and so we settle for the smaller fish, and we miss out on the big things that God can do. Just imagine how much more fish that guy would have had. He would have been able to feed his family for weeks, but he was thinking too small. You see, we fail to tap into God's ability when we think too small, but we get the advantage of God's ability when we remember the possibilities are limitless with God. Where in your life are you thinking too small about what God can do? What about us as a church here at BCC? Where are we thinking too small about what he can do in and through us in this neighborhood? You see, God has huge possibilities for all of us. He has huge possibilities for us as a church. All we need is a little faith. To give him all that we have, even if it's a little bit. To take steps of faith and to give him every jar we can get our hands on. You see, the possibilities are limitless with God. The story ends in verse 7. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." After every single jar that she collected was full, she had enough to sell off and pay off all her creditors, with enough remaining for her family to live on. The point I think we need to see here is that we have more than we think when we offer God the little that we have. This is what the woman learned. God takes what we offer him, even the little things, and he multiplies them, and he uses them in amazingly big ways. So often we think too small. We don't factor in God's ability, his power, and so we don't attempt to do great things for him. The limiting factor is not God. The limiting factor is us. Little is much when we put it in God's hands. Think of all the examples of this in the Bible. God used Abraham and Sarah, two weak and aged, childless seniors, to be the source from whom an entire nation would spring. He used a young boy sold into slavery by his jealous brothers to rule the nation of Egypt and to eventually provide a food source for the Hebrew people. He made a shepherd boy into Israel's greatest king. He used the small lunch of another boy to feed over 5,000 people. And he used 12 uneducated men to turn the world upside down. Faith is being all in, burning the plows and cooking the cows. And faith is giving all that we have, even if it's just a little bit. With God, the possibilities are limitless. Let's pray. God, you are such a good God. And with you, there is no limit. And so we ask that you would give us the courage, that you would give us the strength to give you all that we have, even if it's just a little bit. The courage to take steps forward in faith. And that you would give us the courage to collect as many jars as we can to bring them to you. Your power is limitless. Amen.